Hello, welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for collective liberation. I'm Damien.
And I'm Aaron. Thank you so much for joining us today. Each week, we'll bring something new to the table and discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And Aaron, you're up this week. Yes. What are you bringing to the table today?
It is March, but I'm bringing our February book to the table.
Yes.
So I'm bringing The Black Antifascist Tradition, Fight Back From Anti-Lynching to Abolition by Jeanelle K and Bill Mullen.
Yes.
And this was published by Haymarket Books back in April of 2024. And it's a survey of anti-Black fascist history here in the U.S. and the history of anti-fascist Black resistance.
Yes.
And they go deep into history here from the collapse of Reconstruction and violent backlash by the state and vigilante groups there, all the way up to the current abolitionist movements in the way that is grounded in anarchist, anti-fascist traditions, Black anarchist, anti-fascist traditions in the U.S. and in history in this country.
Right.
But let me use Jeanelle and Bill's words to illustrate this a little bit more and introduce this a little bit more clearly.
Okay.
So they say, quote, "The Black Antifascist Tradition aspires to be a body of work that compiles and animates the dynamism of Black activism that has always resisted and pushed back on the boot of fascism. Acknowledging and remembering this long tradition that spans both space and time, we hope this work not only sparks renewed interest in studying fascism, particularly within Black studies, but also empowers those at the grassroots to take up the tradition and become anti-fascists themselves."
Oh, I like that.
Yes.
Yeah.
This is such a rich book that
Yes.
covers a lot of ground and maps out how Black anti-fascism has evolved over the years through many different kinds of movements and work.
Yes.
And tells a story of a lot of history that was new to me,
Yes.
which is always great to learn, and I'm always deeply appreciative when I'm learning new stuff.
Yep.
Learning new history. So enough rambling from me. How about you? What did you think?
Yeah, no, this was an incredible book. And I think I said this last week when you introed it, but it's so thorough.
Yeah, it's really great.
Yeah, and like you said, it's rich and full of history and important context setting and examples of how fascism has existed. Actually, I think around the world, like there's a global perspective here too, and how it's been such a threat to Black people and Black people's existence in this world. And honestly, you know, how it's been a threat to all people.
Yeah.
You can certainly extrapolate that from what's in this book. And I think the other important context within this book is how the tradition of Black anti-fascism has been and is a necessary path and to fight against fascism and against anti-Blackness and in the fight for collective liberation and our freedom. And so, yeah, this was great. I think you're right. There's so much that I learned from this book too. I feel like we would be talking for hours if we sat and just listed out all the things that we learned in this book. Every chapter, like a war or history or something. I was like, I didn't know that. So
Yeah, it would just become an audiobook.
it really would be. We would just be reading it. Yeah. But one of the things that stood out to me in the introduction of this book was the crystal clear warning about the dangers of anti-Black fascism. So they say, quote, "Some of the most important texts, slogans, and practices within the Black anti-fascist tradition define anti-Black fascism as not only a political death threat against the Black race, but also as an alarm and bellwether for the future of the human. Black anti-fascism thus describes an oppositional lived experience under racial capitalism that understands the conditions of Black life as a litmus test for the survival of the species and the planet. Black anti-fascism seeks to build and sustain radical forms of solidarity, whatever forms they take, to midwife both the extinction of anti-Black fascism and the potentiation of a new world beyond it." Mm-hmm. And I love that quote. I love particularly that word potentiation. I was like, ooh, what a fun word. But in all seriousness, that statement of how the conditions of Black life are a litmus test for the survival of everyone, that to me was so powerful. And it's so true, thinking about the ways in which society this country has treated Black people throughout history. And I think how they expertly centered the importance of the Black anti-fascist tradition and the fight against anti-Black fascism and you know, that how that set the context for the rest of this book was really important. And so I was hooked right from the beginning as a result of that. And again, it, you know, set us on a very thorough examination and analysis, as you say, throughout the rest of the book.
Yeah, and I appreciated the way that they tied in things that may not have explicitly been anti-fascist at the time.
Yes.
But looking back, recognizing that these elements of fascism were operating.
Yes.
And these were resistance movements and resistance to those elements of fascism.
Yes.
And so therefore they are part of the Black anti-fascist tradition.
Absolutely.
And so I appreciated that historical analysis too, to bring more things into this, to really describe it as a full tradition in the same way that we talk about the radical Black tradition.
Yes, absolutely.
Which are connected,
Well,
obviously.
of course. Yep. Yeah, absolutely.
So one of the fascinating pieces of history that I learned about was about Black anti-fascist work during World War II. And really it was the precursor to the FBI's COINTELPRO program.
Yeah.
Which that's like saying ATM machine. So my apologies. But there was this thing called Racial Conditions in the United States, or RACON, I guess. It's RACON, RACON.
Yep.
So this was run out of the FBI and focused on movement leaders who were speaking out against racism in the United States and rising fascist movements in Europe. They were speaking out there. They were acting against those movements as well. So Jeanelle and Bill say, quote, "The special attacks by RACON targeting Black radicals during World War II underscore the particular threat that Black anti-fascism represented to a U.S. state seeking to purge the memory of the fight against Spanish fascism in the name of shoring up anti-communism at home and sanctifying U.S. power for the coming Cold War." RACON also anticipated the better-known COINTELPRO campaign of the 1960s, which similarly targeted Black radicals bold enough to declare the U.S. a fascist state. And so one of the things I really appreciate about learning this history is seeing just how much the FBI has always been about tracking and targeting organizers and activists who are considered radical by the U.S. standards and trying to discredit folks.
Always, yes.
So it's just been there. And I know that there's some romanticism around trying to catch bank robbers and all this stuff.
And what we see in movies, right? Yes,
Yeah.
yes. But
And we also see that, oh, you're trying to target radicals, Black radicals who are speaking out. You're trying to target union leaders who are trying to get decent wages and working conditions for their workers.
Yep.
And it's also been about that. It's also been about
Yes.
state control of these movements.
Absolutely.
And, you know, COINTELPRO is relatively well known,
Yep.
but this kind of thing stretches back in a formal sense to RACON, which is a formal government program that mirrors the surveillance of Black people by plantation owners, overseers, slave patrols, and vigilante groups like the Klan.
Yes.
And so, in a way, this is just the Klan with a badge.
Ooh, yes.
So we can see that resistance to the state has always been something that the state has tried to control, either formally or through unsanctioned but unregulated, and therefore informally approved groups.
Yes.
And so this is just a way to formalize that anti-Black, anti-poor work to stop people from organizing themselves and trying to resist the empire that is trying to keep people down.
Yeah, it's so funny that you say the word empire. That's what pops into my mind, like sort of the empirical control of people, right? And the surveillance of folks and the squashing of anything that they're doing to challenge the state and challenge the empire in any way. Yeah, I agree. All of that was so fascinating to learn about because we've talked about that FBI program before on this podcast, but it was great to learn more about sort of this precursor to it, if you will. Yeah, I was fascinated by that.
Yeah.
And all of that really relates to the We Charge Genocide petition, which I want to talk about. The We Charge Genocide petition was presented to the United Nations in December of 1951 by the Civil Rights Congress. And so here's what Jeanelle and Bill shared about that. They said, quote, "Inspired by the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, adopted by the General Assembly on December 9th, 1948, in response to the Nazi Holocaust. The petition applied the convention's definition of genocide as killing members of the group to charge the U.S. government with mass murder of its own nationals, with institutionalized oppression and persistent slaughter of the Negro people in the United States on the basis of race. The petition cited the U.S. history of slavery, lynchings, police killings, and murders committed in a war against Black people as evidence of a continuous strain of anti-Black fascism in America, analogous and akin to Hitler's decimation of European Jews. Like Césaire, the authors of We Charge Genocide also argued that anti-Black fascism was a crime against humanity and called for an end to it in order to save the world from future destruction. And I think what's key here is that this petition was such a turning point and a cornerstone in the Black anti-fascist tradition, and it brought so much needed attention to and a spotlight on how anti-Black fascism was baked into the American experience. And as you talk about, like part of the empire's toolkit, and how all of this certainly impacted the lives of and the lived experiences of Black people in this country, whether they be Black anarchists or organizers or just everyday people. And all of that just connects so well to what you just talked about, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. And I one of the things I appreciate about this book is the way that you see anti-fascism work evolve.
Yes.
And so this was a particular moment where people were trying to use the law against fascism.
Yes.
And as a tool. And so going to the UN and using the convention around the definition of genocide and using that as a way to analyze what's happening in the United States. All of that was a particular strategy.
Yeah, it's such a smart strategy.
Yeah. And seeking international assistance and attention for what's happening here.
Absolutely.
I thought was a brilliant thing to attempt to do.
Yes.
And so I really appreciate the strains and the different ways and paths that people chose to pursue an anti-fascist agenda. And this particular one was fascinating to me of trying to go to the UN to say, this is what's happening here, and we need you to intervene.
We need help, yeah.
And another segment of this anti-fascist tradition is something called Marxist-Leninist Maoism, or MLM.
Yep.
Which tripped me up a little bit because that's also a multi-level marketing.
Oh my
scam.
gosh! Wow, no,
So
I did not think of that. That's true. Yeah,
yeah. As I went back to notes, I was like, "What? Multi-level marketing?
Yeah.
I'm so confused."
when did I miss that?
And then I remembered Marxism, Leninism, and Maoism. So anyway, Jeanelle and Bill summarize it as 3 particular points. They say MLM stresses the following: quote, 1, the proletariat masses should be among the vanguard of society. 2, in order to understand the current class conditions, historical materialism must be at the center, thus outlining the necessity of the emergence of communism in lieu of capitalism, the former of which was regarded as a more just economic and social system. And 3, a commitment to a united front with emphasis on unity across the Third World to advance anti-colonial, anti-imperial, and anti-fascist movements. And I really appreciate this sort of amalgamation of theory from these 3 people with some extra explicit anti-fascist flavors that I think get accentuated when all of it comes together.
Yeah.
I think bringing class, marginalized people together to recognize the shared conditions seems really central here, which I appreciate because it also leaves room, in my view, at least, for the understanding the different experiences that people have across their class conditions in regards to gender and sex and race.
Yep.
But all of that coming together as a united front to, quote, advance anti-colonial, anti-imperial, and anti-fascist movements.
Yes.
And this also feels connected to a moment earlier in the book when Jeanelle and Bill are writing about women in the Black Panther Party who know that, quote, a race first or race only stance was neither anti-fascist nor revolutionary.
Right.
And so I think we have to keep these systems of oppression interconnected in our work and in our minds, in our sights, because fascism finds its way in through sexism or xenophobia or homophobia or whatever else.
Yes.
And so if we're not vigilant, we're only paying attention to one element, it can sneak in a back door through these other things that we allow because we're not paying attention to them.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think one of the most powerful things in this book and in thinking about anti-Blackness and Black anti-fascism work has been the through line of class and the intersection of class through all of this, and how powerful of a tool that can be, because it connects all of us in so many ways. And it is a way in to get folks on board, I think, and to help people understand how these systems and this oppression impacts all of us. And so, what a great analysis there, my friend. I love that. I think it's one of the final chapters in the book and final conversations in the book focuses on abolitionist anti-fascism and how the movement for abolition builds on the Black antifascist tradition. And that chapter really centered the relationship between Black life and fascism in this country, and talked about how they're linked, and why I think it really makes clear why so many of us included, believe that abolition is the only way forward for our fight. Yeah. And really enjoyed learning more about so many abolitionist organizers and scholars and organizations that have done work. This is part of the book that earns it the title of being so thorough, because we learn from folks like Angela Davis and Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Dylan Rodriguez, Frank Wilderson, Miriam Kaba, organizations like Critical Resistance, We Charge Genocide, the Malcolm X grassroots movement, the Black Panther Party, and the Movement for Black Lives. Like, we see all of this work, all of this abolitionist anti-fascism work spelled out for us. And and that's only a snippet of what's presented in this chapter. So I loved all of that. But I also really appreciated Jeanelle and Bill's analysis around the beginnings of abolitionist anti-fascism, because this is the reason why this book is so great, because it gives us this full scope of these things.
Absolutely.
So they said, quote, abolitionist anti-fascism from its inception, imagine the Black poor and working classes as legislators of the world. Seizing the means of legal production was seen as fundamental to enabling the revolutionary transformation of racial capitalism. This through line conjoined the Black Panther Party to the Free Angela Davis Committee to the Soledad Brothers to Davis herself. And to me, it's that line, legislators of the world, that's so profound. The ways in which this country, I think, has treated Black, poor, and working classes has told us and shown us everything we need to know about this country and its history and its impact on folks. And I think until we're able to reckon with that and change it, right, it's hard to see how any of us can truly be free under fascism, you know?
Yeah, and it reminds me, that legislators of the world piece remind me of the people's assemblies that have been arranged in places that we've read about. And I think it was mentioned in this book at some point.
Yep.
And how that feels like something to amplify and pursue as a tactic in our current moment.
Absolutely. I love that.
So I think that's great stuff.
Yeah.
All right, well, let's talk about application.
Okay.
What is a people's assembly other than application?
Come on now.
But this is the Partner Show. We talk about how we apply what we've learned from this book to our everyday lives. My application, I think, is directly applicable to what we're seeing today, with huge government cuts to programs led by a man who is known in most of the corners of the internet that I hang out in as Apartheid Clyde.
Yes.
He's got some other nicknames too.
He does.
Yeah, he makes swastikars.
Oh boy, yes.
So I think this is an illustration of how much private business has gained further control over the mechanisms of government today. And Jeanelle and Bill quote a very famous fascist here who said, quote, fascism should more properly be called corporatism because it is the merger of state and corporate power.
Wow.
And that's Benito Mussolini who said that.
Yeah.
And Jeanelle and Bill share that, quote, the convergence of state and corporate interests was at the crux of Benito Mussolini's vision of fascism in Italy. And how else could we describe Donald Trump, Elon Musk, and the other absolute ghouls in this administration, but as the merger of state and corporate power with little pieces of toxic masculinity and a bunch of other stuff that
white supremacy, all of it.
Yeah, you know, listening to Joe Rogan and doing whatever. And so it's all of those things mashed up, but I think they all they all exist in service to merger of state and corporate power.
Yes, Absolutely. I mean, yeah, that's a quote from Mussolini,
Mm-hmm.
and it absolutely applies to our present day situation here in this country. Absolutely.
Yeah. What else is Elon doing other than that? Right?
That's it. That's it. Yeah, that's great application and scary application.
Yeah.
My application comes from the epilogue of this book. I think Jeanelle and Bill do a really great job in highlighting the prominence and the power of anti-Black fascism and how it has shaped the Black experience in this country. And to me, it's all the rationale anyone should need to fight against it at all costs. And so the things that they highlight as being hallmarks, if you will, of anti-Black fascism, particularly here in the United States at our present time, include the curtailing of voting rights, casting doubts on election integrity, attacking public education, and trampling on and even eliminating personal freedoms and civil liberties. Yeah, right?
Wow.
And they offer examples of each of those things. I think we've talked about every single one of those things here on this podcast. I
think so.
And they juxtapose all of that with what took place on January 6th, 2021, as a sign or a manifestation of what the modern fascist movement has become, which to me made all of this crystal clear. And one of the things that they say towards the end of this chapter, this epilogue, is, quote, just as we've pointed to in this book, fascism and anti-Blackness are inseparable, as so much of white supremacy and fascism is predicated on the control and subjugation of Black people. So we have to recognize that fact, right? That fact being the ways in which fascism and anti-Blackness are linked, because I think when we can recognize that, we're better able to work together to fight against it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
I think recognizing that they're linked together and they have been linked together since
The dawn of time.
is, I think, really important. And I think back to the racism and fascism essay from Toni Morrison.
Yes, which is referenced in this book.
Yes, it
Yes.
is. And the ways that she outlines how, fascism at its core is really about othering people.
Yes.
And the other for generations, for centuries now, has been Black and African people.
Absolutely.
And so there's direct correlation, there's direct history, and other people get othered along the way.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah, I think you sent me a Snapchat of the first page of the epilogue that featured that Toni Morrison quote, and I hadn't gotten there yet, and I was like, "Oh, it's going to be good! I can't wait!" And
Yeah.
it was, yes.
It was a great book. All right, well, let's talk about homework.
Okay.
What are we going to do to continue our learning and unlearning after our conversation today? Look, there's so much in here that I want to
Yes.
read now, but I'll just mention two things,
Okay.
which I guess means I'm showing some restraint. The first is a book by Dylan Rodriguez called Forced Passages, Imprisoned Radical Intellectuals and the U.S. Prison Regime, which sounds like a fantastic way to continue our education about abolition.
Absolutely.
And the other, speaking of continuing our education about abolition, is from a group called Prison Research Education Action Program, or PREAP, who, quote, published the first abolitionist prison manifesto in the U.S. in 1976, which is called Instead of Prisons. Jeanelle and Bill go on to say this about Instead of Prisons. Quote, the book's 9-point perspective for abolition was rooted in a moral and empathic critique of prisons, a call for reconciliation, not punishment, for the empowerment of prisoners, and for the creation of a caring community in which corporate and individual redemption can take place. Caring community was defined further as one in which power and equality are distributed to all members and where the spirit of reconciliation prevails. An abolitionist, by PREAP's definition, was one invested in building the caring community.
I love that.
So I think that this sounds like a great piece to read that will illustrate more about all the things we've learned about abolition.
Yes.
And define more about where it's come from and where the abolition movement has evolved from. And so I'm looking forward to checking that out and finding it and reading it, and the 9-point perspective for abolition.
Yeah.
I think, it just sounds fascinating. It sounds like a further way to enrich what it is we know about abolition movements.
Absolutely. I love that. Those are two very good books, it sounds like. So I would love to read those. My homework is to also just revisit this book. I feel like I had to rush the end of it a little bit to be prepared for today. And I want to do justice by this book because it's so profound and powerful and amazing. And so I kind of want to just go back and read through all of my highlighting. Lots of highlighting in this book. And I also want to make sure that, I find some time just to go through some of the stories and the history and dig a little bit deeper into those things. And so I definitely just want to go back through this book. I also would love to read some more of Bill Mullen's other books as well. So we've got a lot of books here to read. He's written several books, including books about James Baldwin and W.E. Du Bois and the We Charge Genocide group and petition that we learned about and we talked about, I should say. And so I'd like to check all of those books out as well because this one was outstanding.
Yeah, and we didn't mention it, but there's a whole syllabus at the end of this book that would be fascinating to go through.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and also it would just be fascinating to use as a template for teaching a course.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
They have multiple pieces that in the book that they describe excerpts that you can use from larger texts.
Right.
To get the lessons across in the tradition of Black anti-fascism.
That's great. That's great.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's it for homework. And that's it for our conversation today. What a fantastic book.
Really and truly.
Great way to close out Black History Month.
Yes.
I know it's March. It doesn't matter. We gave Black History Month an extra week this year.
It deserves it.
100%. All right. Well, Damien, you're up next time. What are you bringing to the table in our next episode?
All right. So I'm bringing a documentary to the table for us for our next episode. I feel like I don't often bring the documentaries and the films to the table. That may or may not be true. I don't know. When I found it, I was like, do I do this a lot? Yeah. But whatever. Doesn't matter.
We should have the producer run the numbers.
Hey, we really should. The documentary I'm bringing is called Brother Outsider, The Life of Freedom Fighter Bayard Rustin. And if folks want to watch it with us, you can find it on Canopy through your local library. So this documentary, of course, is just over 20 years old at this point.
Okay.
But we have talked about the role that Bayard Rustin played alongside Dr. King in the civil rights movement here and there through lots of the things that we've consumed about Dr. King. But I think there's probably so much more we can learn about his life and his legacy. And I'm sure many of those lessons can help us and be applied to what we're experiencing right now. And I'm sure we can do that. But even if we can't, I'm sure it would just be a great film to watch. So I'm looking forward to doing that and to talking about it with you next week.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's been on our list for a little bit.
Yeah.
So I'm looking forward to getting to that.
Yeah.
All right. Well, with that, we want to thank you for joining us today. You know what I'm going to ask you to do here, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with the people in your life. Follow us on social media, including Instagram, TikTok, Blue Sky. Check us out on YouTube and sign up and join us on Patreon to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes. Thank you so much for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about all of us. And we'll talk to you next week.